The silence of a digital ghost town is far louder than the noise of a crowded market. For decades, the flow of information across the northern border of the Western world was treated as an invisible, frictionless constant, a stream of data that powered small businesses, informed the public, and fueled a multi-billion-dollar advertising machine. But a sudden systemic shift in the regulatory architecture has turned that stream into a series of walls. This isn't just a story about a legislative update or a localized policy change. It is the first major fracture in the unified digital experience of the West. When one of the world's most advanced G7 economies decided to rewrite the rules for how digital services interact with local media, they didn't just change a line of code, they triggered a chain reaction that has forced the world's largest search engine to fundamentally re-engineer how it values information. The world is watching because what is happening in Canada is no longer a local experiment. It is a stress test for the entire global internet infrastructure. The reaction was immediate. Within weeks of the digital services updates, the very fabric of the Canadian digital ecosystem began to unravel. Links that had existed for 20 years vanished. Ad placements that once targeted thriving demographics shifted into a void of non-compliance zones. To the casual observer, it looks like a dispute over revenue sharing, but to the institutional architect, it represents something far more tectonic, the end of the borderless web. We are witnessing the birth of a fragmented internet, where your access to information is no longer determined by your interests, but by the specific legal jurisdiction of your IP address. It represents a pivot from a global data commons to a gated digital community. This move has sent shockwaves through the advertising world. For Google's ad operations, Canada became a laboratory of friction. The precision-engineered algorithms that once delivered the right message to the right person at the perfect moment suddenly hit a wall of legal static. When the mechanics of indexing become a liability rather than a service, the economic value of every click is thrown into question. If a platform is forced to pay for the privilege of sending traffic to a provider, the traditional win-win of digital discovery is inverted. The psychological shift for the user is just as profound. The search bar, once a window to the world, has become a filter determined by a balance sheet. This matters to every individual with a smartphone because it challenges the fundamental assumption that the internet is a universal utility. In behavioral economics, we call this a loss aversion event. Users who took the availability of news and data for granted are now realizing that their digital environment is a leased space, subject to the negotiations of giants. As the advertising engines recalibrate, the cost of reaching an audience is rising, and that cost is being passed down to the consumer in ways that aren't immediately visible on a receipt. We are entering an era where the cost of free information is becoming too high for the platforms to carry. But while the public focuses on the loss of news links, a much more sophisticated mechanism is being dismantled behind the scenes, a mechanism that dictates the very gravity of the global market. To understand the current crisis, one must look beneath the interface and into the plumbing of the $600 billion global ad market. The hidden mechanics of this shift lie in the concept of signal-to-noise ratios. For years, Google's ad operations relied on a symbiotic relationship with content providers. The content provided the context, and the ads provided the revenue. However, when the digital services rules introduced a link tax or mandatory compensation model, it effectively turned every outbound link into a potential debit on a balance sheet. This changed the psychology of the institution from one of maximum discovery to calculated exclusion. The stakes are not just about millions of dollars in fees. They are about the integrity of the crawl. If an algorithm is programmed to avoid certain data points to stay compliant, the search engine is no longer a map of the world. It is a curated gallery. The institutional psychology here is driven by risk mitigation. For a platform like Google, the danger isn't the payment itself, it's the precedent. If Canada can successfully mandate a price for the act of linking, then the core logic of the World Wide Web, the hyperlink, is no longer free. This creates a massive technical debt. Ad operations must now distinguish between commercial traffic and protected traffic. This forced bifurcation has led to a degradation of the machine learning models that predict consumer behavior. When you remove a massive chunk of high-quality data from the training set, the ads become less relevant, the clicks become more expensive, and the return on investment for small businesses collapses. This is the data drought, a systematic drying up of the information needed to keep the digital economy liquid. This policy decision created an unforeseen friction in the auction system. Google's ad business runs on a real-time auction that happens in the milliseconds it takes for a page to load. By introducing a regulatory layer that flags certain types of content as liable, the auction becomes sluggish. It introduces a latency of compliance. The system now has to check, is this link regulated? Does this publisher require a fee? Does this ad align with the new visibility rules? The efficiency of the global market relies on these milliseconds. When you break the speed of the auction, you break the profitability of the advertiser. It is a quiet, invisible tax on the efficiency of the entire Canadian digital economy. But here is the part that nobody expected. The rules didn't just affect the news. Because the ad operations are so deeply integrated, the compliance shadow began to creep into other sectors. Real estate, retail, and local services found their visibility hampered as the platform's safe search for regulatory compliance accidentally throttled unrelated industries. The machine was trying to protect the company from fines, and in doing so, it began to dim the lights on the entire digital storefront. This wasn't an intentional blackout, it was a systemic immune response. The algorithm recognized a regulatory virus and began shutting down its own pathways to survive. And as these pathways closed, the global community began to realize that Canada was merely the first domino in a much larger geopolitical game. The world is currently observing a massive historical parallel to the era of the telegraph wars of the 19th century, where nations fought over who controlled the wires and who could tax the messages. Today, the wires are invisible, but the battle for digital sovereignty is just as fierce. From the European Union's strict privacy mandates to Australia's bargaining codes, a new map of the world is being drawn. Not by borders of land, but by borders of data. The Canadian situation is being viewed by other nations as a blueprint for reclaiming the digital surplus. Historically, when a resource becomes essential to a nation's stability, like information has become, the state eventually moves to nationalize or heavily regulate its flow. We are seeing the deglobalization of the internet in real time. From a behavioral economics perspective, this represents a shift from permissionless innovation to permissioned participation. In the early days of the web, anyone could link to anything. This created a high-velocity power structure where the most relevant content won. Now, power is shifting back to the intermediaries and the regulators. Other markets are watching Canada to see if the big tech giants will actually blink. If Google adjusts its ad operations to accommodate one nation, it must eventually do so for all. This creates a race to the middle, where the global digital experience is lowered to the standard of the most restrictive jurisdiction. It's a power structure insight that reveals the true vulnerability of global platforms. They are actually just a collection of local licenses. This deeper context reveals a psychological tension between access and value. In countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and across the EU, the Canadian model is being debated as a way to protect local culture from the algorithmic hegemony of Silicon Valley. They see the disruption of Google's ad operations not as a failure, but as a successful reassertion of national authority. The historical parallel here is the protectionism of the mid-20th century, where high tariffs were used to build local industry. The link tax is the 21st century tariff. It is a tax on the flow of attention. But while governments see this as a way to fund local journalism, the market sees it as a complexity premium that makes doing business in those countries less attractive. It gets deeper when you look at the incentive structures for future technologies. If every piece of data has a regulatory price tag, the development of artificial intelligence and large language models becomes an atmospheric challenge. These models require trillions of data points to function. If the Canadian model becomes the global standard, the crawlable web will shrink by 80%. We are looking at a future where only the wealthiest corporations can afford to read the internet, because every page view carries a legal liability. The digital divide will no longer be about who has a computer. It will be about which countries have allowed their data to be part of the global brain. This is the hidden pivot, the shift from a web of people to a web of gated intellectual property. It is a fundamental rewriting of the social contract between those who create information and those who organize it. The real-world impact of this digital realignment is already being felt at the kitchen table, though most families don't recognize the cause. When ad operations are disrupted, The cost of customer acquisition for your local bakery, your local plumber, or your favorite independent brand spikes. When it becomes harder for Google to connect a buyer with a seller due to regulatory noise, the seller has to spend more to be seen. This hidden inflation is a direct result of the friction introduced by the digital services rules. We are seeing a decline in the discovery economy where people find what they need through search. Instead, we are being pushed into subscription silos. If you can't find it on a search engine, you have to already know where it is. This favors the giants and crushes the newcomers. What the media isn't discussing is the data migration currently taking place. Because the Canadian digital market has become high friction, capital and talent are quietly moving toward jurisdictions with more fluid data laws. In the world of high-frequency digital trade, money follows the path of least resistance. We are seeing a pattern where the very rules designed to save local media may ironically starve the local digital ecosystem of the advertising dollars it needs to survive. The psychology of the market is one of flight to simplicity. If it's too hard to run an ad campaign in a specific region, the budget simply moves to a different platform or a different country. The result isn't a better funded local media, it's a quieter, more isolated local economy. The most serious implication, however, is the information asymmetry it creates. When a search engine's ad operations are hindered, the quality of information provided to the user changes. We are moving toward a pay-to-play index. This is a fundamental shift in how human knowledge is organized. For the last 2 decades, the goal was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. The new goal, dictated by these shifting rules, is to organize the world's information according to local licensing agreements. This is the death of the Universal Library and the birth of the Regional Archive. It is a move that prioritizes the stability of old institutions over the potential of new ones. We are currently standing at the precipice of a new digital order. The Canadian experiment has proven that the giants can be forced to change, but it has also revealed the high price of that change. The friction we see today in ad operations is just the first symptom of a much larger systemic decoupling. The internet as we knew it, a single, global, frictionless entity, is being dismantled piece by piece, link by link. The real transformation isn't about news links or ad revenue, it's about the fundamental right to connect. Because while the world is focused on this legislative battle in the north, the real shift is already happening somewhere else, in the very code that determines what you are allowed to see before you even know you're looking for it. And the next evolution of this invisible border is being built in a sector that most people still think is just a toy, waiting to redefine the very nature of reality itself.